Hi, good morning. It really is an enormous honor and pleasure to be here, and great talks this morning. Really wonderful to follow that up. I'm Inbal Ben Ami. I'm a researcher at Sagol, School of Neuroscience at Tel Aviv University. So Sami and Tova, you really actually are supporting, me personally and a lot of other scientists in Israel, and your support to science is really remarkable and has enabled so many of us to do things that we wouldn't be able to do otherwise. So thank you very much. And I'm really interested in understanding why we help other people, and particularly people in distress. And I'm going to talk today about the neural networks that are involved in this type of behavior. And I'm going to take a rather different approach than the rest of the talks, because I do more molecular type of research that's focused on understanding what happens in the brain in terms of which cells are involved in these types of behaviors and which neuromodulators are involved. And for that, we actually use a rodent model. We do our research with rats in my lab. But the questions that we're interested in exploring are focused on really what happens in your brain from the moment that you see somebody in distress to that moment where you decide to approach and help that individual. And this is really quite an important question, and especially because our tendency to decide to go and help somebody else is really influenced by the identity of that individual. And deciding why we care so much about the pain and distress of one individual, but we're not at all moved by a different individual because of things like their group identity or things that determine who they are, is really, I think, the most important question of our time today. And the reason that we really need to figure out different strategies to approach this type of problem, because all of the enormous resources that have gone into advancing helping and empathy and prosociality in our culture, have been moderately successful at best. And we need to find new strategies, because the challenges that we are facing as a species are not the type of challenges that we will be able to face with this growing polarization that we've been seeing in our culture. I can speculate about why that's been happening and what, the role of social media in that and things like that. But, if you ask why do I study this question in a rodent model and not in humans, is because I really believe that this type of research provides us a very unique perspective into the basic drivers of our behavior, that we can strip away some of this complexity that maybe confuses us when we're looking at our really complex human minds. So in advance, I'd like to apologize if some of the views that I take are a little bit reductionist today when we're thinking about something like emotions. But I want to take you back a little bit, back evolutionarily, and think about the biological basis of this type of behavior. And what you're seeing here in this picture is an award-winning photo, is a marmot that's been found by a fox, and actually in the next few minutes this marmot would actually lose its life to the fox, unfortunately. But it's really striking to see the facial expression of this marmot, and I think we can all identify with what must be going on for that animal in that moment. And, the very basic role of emotions for us is, as my colleagues have already mentioned, is to try to determine, to organize our behavior, whether we should approach something or avoid a certain stimulus. And, as organisms have become more and more complex, this need to be able to make that decision very quickly without prior, experience in that specific moment. Like, I don't need to stick my finger into the socket every time. I remember that last time I did it, it hurt, or I saw somebody else do it, and, something terrible happened to them. So that determines my behavior. That's a really important role for emotions. But emotions have another role that we haven't really focused on in the earlier talks today, and that's a social role. Because emotions are, not only organizing our behavior, they also are a very important part of communicating with others. And actually, almost more than 80% of the species on Earth, I think that's the research, are social species. And what social means is you send signals for others to be received by others, and that influence the action of other organisms in your environment. And that's actually not only true for animals, that's also true for some plants. So, so this really important role in survival and reproduction is communicating the internal state to other individuals and influence the way that they will respond. And this, we can study this with rodents because they are actually remarkably similar to us in many ways in the evolutionarily conserved neural structures and autonomic system, endocrine activity that support all these very basic social behaviors, from nurturing to managing life in a social environment. And I, in my lab, focus on empathy and the way that influences our drive to help somebody in distress. But I don't really think of empathy as an emotion, so I can get away maybe with studying it in rats. Because what I think about empathy, I think about a mechanism for transferring an affective state or an emotional state between individuals. And what you're seeing here sums up a couple of decades of research in human subjects. And, when we see somebody experiencing pain or distress, we have a very, very typical response that you can see in this facial expression, right? An aversive emotional response to somebody else's pain or distress. And it's been demonstrated that this vicarious negative aversive arousal to somebody else's pain or distress is based on activity in this neural network that we think of as processing the affective or emotional components of pain or distress. And so this neural network that's actually quite dispersed in the brain and doesn't require complex cognitive mechanisms per se, but involves regions from the brain stem to areas involving limbic emotional processing. The anterior insula and the anterior cingulate cortex in particular are two areas that are involved in this awareness of an aversive response. Even when you see something disgusting, for instance, the system is activated. And we know that not only are the same regions active for your own distress and another person's distress that you observe, it's actually the very same neurons that we see active in regions like the anterior cingulate cortex. So we tend to think of this as a neural basis for empathic responding or resonance. And in the field of psychology, we often postulate that this empathic response to other people's pain is a really important driver for prosocial behavior, like helping. Okay, and this really intuitive idea has been widely researched by important investigators that have shown a correlation between how much people report they feel empathy and how how much are they willing to help or to give, to provide support or any kind of help to somebody else. And so, you know, it is true that helping others and working for others is a really important part of our life in social groups, and we see it in ways that are big and small in our everyday life, but especially we respond to others in distress. And this connection between this distress response and how we respond to it actually probably happens in a different neural system. It's not this aversive negative arousal that we see, rather it's activity in this motivational network, what we call the reward network, a network that involves this drive to approach or to act, to seek something that is desired by us. So this system that we see activated is a system that we activate in other situations. For example, if we eat something delicious or we win money. And in human studies, it's been shown that this system is activated when people donate money or social resources. So this so-called, you know, inherent glow of helping or acting in a positive pro-social way is a very interesting part of this behavior. And actually, sort of an emerging scientific field is trying to investigate the mechanism by which doing things for others or working for the greater good actually improves the well-being of the helpers. This is something, you know, that's well anchored in ancient philosophical thought or Buddhist, you know, ideas. But now we're actually trying to look also at the molecular mechanisms that explain why doing for others improves our own well-being and our own immune resilience and things like that. So in my work, I've focused on rodents, particularly rats, based on a pretty solid body of evidence across different labs across the world, demonstrating that rats and mice have basic empathic capacities. They're influenced by the pain and distress of others. They are emotionally contagious by other animals' distress and even itch or pain. And so rats are a really social animal. They even, you know, they have very social behaviors like growing their pups together in the wild, or they have very complex social hierarchies. So in that sense, you know, they're not very dissimilar to us. And so in our lab, we use this paradigm that looks at a very simple test. Will a rat be motivated by the distress of another individual to help that animal? And in this situation, one animal is trapped in this little jail. It's called a restrainer, which has a door that can be opened from the outside. And the rat on the outside can open the door and release the trapped rat on the inside. And what we see is that after a few days of experiencing this paradigm for 1 hour every day, the rats just learn without any previous reward or training. They learn how to open this door, which is not an easy feat, and they release the rat inside. And they do this even when they don't have a chance to interact with the animal on the inside. You can see here a very pink rat and a very blue rat. Those are just colors that we use for the video tracking. And in this situation, you can see this female rat learning to open the door from the side, which is pretty heavy and hard for her to push down. And rats will continue to do this behavior. Even when they don't get to play with the other rat, they will continue to do this every day for months at a time. And they are doing it specifically to alleviate the distress of the trapped rat. We know this because we can block helping behavior by blocking the transfer of the stress with basic pharmacological interventions. So, you know, rats, like us, are not just kind to any rat. Like us, they have an empathy bias for outgroup members. You know, humans, you know, we are very biased to helping our own group members. there are many studies showing parochial altruism plays a major role in our society, and I think we all are familiar with this from our daily lives, and that's a topic for a whole course of study, so I'm not going to elaborate too much of that. But I will tell you that rats also respond to their in-group members. So while rats help cage mates that they're familiar with and strangers from their own strain, they do not at all help strangers from an unfamiliar strain. In this picture, you can see the strangers from the other strain have this black cape fur on their backs, and they look very different, and they don't get helped at all. So this disparity allows for us to test what do the brains of these rats look like in situations where they're feeling pro-social motivation, as opposed to situations where they're not interested at all in helping the other rats. I want to say something encouraging with a message of world peace, is that this is totally flexible. So if rats are co-housed together for 2 weeks, that's enough not only to get them to totally shift their pro-social motivation and help that cage mate from the other strain, but then they also help strangers from the outgroup. After they have 2 weeks of co-housing, I wish we were that nice. So to ask what happens biologically, and we're interested in a very holistic, systemic sort of view. So we want to know what happens, which brain regions are active. We also want to know which hormones are released, what happens in the body of these animals, what do they find exciting, to help us to ask all these questions about the motivational state of these animals. And we combine cutting-edge neuroscience methods to recreate a sort of fMRI kind of approach in humans, and conduct a brain-wide mapping of the neural activity in these rats. We do that using fluorescent markers to tag neurons that were active while rats were performing this task. And we can also trace those neurons that were active and ask, where do they come from? And which subsets of populations are involved specifically in the decision to approach and help. And we can also measure activity using calcium indicators. We can measure activity while these rats are moving around and performing this task to really see instant by instant what is happening in their brains as they're approaching the trapped rats. And trying to sum up a big body of research here in a couple of slides, I will just tell you the bottom line. The bottom line is that what we see is that these rats that are with a trapped rat activate the same network that we consider the empathy network in humans who respond to others in pain or distress. The very same regions, the anterior insula, the anterior cingulate cortex, areas in the prefrontal cortex that are active, and also other areas related to social memory and aversive processing. But the interesting thing is that this empathic activity doesn't at all predict whether those rats will help the trapped rat or not. We see this activity also with rats with the outgroup members. So the way that we interpret this is to say this network, this aversive response network, is used to process the fact that the other rat is in distress. But what does predict whether somebody will help or not? It's activity in the reward network that you can see active here in red. So the reward network that is the very same network that we see in humans donating money or social resources that I mentioned before, we also see solely and uniquely in these rats who are helping the trapped rats. And so what we're trying to figure out is how this empathy network and this motivational reward network combine together to provide this helping behavior. And, the other aspect that I mentioned is how exactly the identity or this categorization of social identity happen in the brain to influence the whole cascade of emotional and motivational responses. I think that's a really important question that is really not well understood today. But it is becoming more well understood, and what I want to suggest is that basically your whole brain participates in this type of response. And areas of social memory are used to identify the group membership of this rat. We have evidence for that from newer studies that are not yet published. CA2 and hippocampus participates in that. And areas in sensory cortex that are used to respond to the distress calls, for instance, act in a completely different way when you value the outcome for the individual in need. So the way that your brain tunes attention to the distress calls of someone and how much you're willing to act for their benefit is influenced by how much you value the outcome of that individual, far more than how much you think they are suffering. For instance, if my daughter cuts her finger, I will be willing to run over to another building and find a Band-Aid for her, even though, it's just a little cut. But somebody else who I don't know or from another group membership can be suffering much more, and I will pass by them on the street and not even notice their pain or suffering. And that's basically the summary slides are trying to present that idea. So that going away, shifting away, based on all these findings from field work with animal models, we're shifting our view that empathy is the main driver for prosocial behavior, because then we would predict that the more you mirror the suffering of the other, the more you will be motivated to help them, to a view where we think of this mirroring or shared distress as one type of process that happens in the brain, and this prosocial drive to approach and help, an innate biologically based prosocial drive, is another type of process. And it is based on the identity of the person in need, and the way to prime helping behavior is to prime the value of the outcome for that other individual. And I would like to thank my amazing lab at Tel Aviv University, who we work on a diverse array of projects. We look at the development of prosocial behavior. We look at the influence of trauma during early life on adult behavior, and try to understand the molecular mechanisms that drive this long-term shift in adult animals who had experienced early life stress. And we look at well-being and trying to understand how the social context or receiving social support, or in contrast, social isolation, which is unfortunately an epidemic of our time, influence our capacity to withstand challenge to our immune system. And we have a very big computational aspect to our research as well that I didn't go into today. But all of these different approaches to really try to understand and develop new strategies for increasing prosociality. Thank you. And one last comment I would like to say, if I may, is that we stand in front of you as aspiring, transformative scientists. And by the way, it doesn't matter if it's a man or a woman. This is true for both. It's actually a team of people who is standing here, and not the people who supported me along the way. Not only my mentors scientifically, my family, my husband, who was always willing to, follow me or across the world, from Israel to Europe, Chicago, Berkeley, back here, and of course, the team of students who are working on all of these projects. And I would like to suggest that we shift away from admiring an individual who is standing here to lauding the idea that Viviana mentioned. The ideas come easy, but to accomplish them and to turn them into reality, it takes a team. And that whole team is standing in front of you now. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Questions before the break? Yes, please. Viviana?
Thank you, very inspiring. I want to ask you about mirror neurons and Rizzolatti, the Italian scientist whose team discovered mirror neurons. You didn't mention them. Is it overcome? Are they still important?
I like to think of mirror neurons as the way that our brain, we've noticed something about the way that our brain processes meaning of a stimulus. So if the same neuron is active when I see the word square and when I see an image of a square, that actually means that that neuron participates in processing the construct of a square. And so I think that there definitely is a very basic neural principle that we can think about as a mirror kind of principle. I kind of shy away from the idea that has become a little too much, where people say there are special neurons that are empathy neurons, okay? And that's a little bit been kind of, for a while, that was the type of conversation that was being heard in my field. And so that's why I kind of on purpose try to skirt that issue. Thank you.
Yes, please, there. 1 second. Oh, where are you? Oh, okay.
Hi, I just want to know if you saw a difference in the result from the gender of the rats and the age of the rats.
We have two papers that are now in the factory. One is about adolescent rats compared to adults, and one is gender differences. And maybe not super surprising. Females are a little bit better at this. But, that being said, actually part of the impetus for starting my whole line of research with male rats was, to try to work with, to try to show that this is a more general phenomena that's not related to maternal care per se, and that's exactly what we see. And, the ambassador has mentioned a really important word, friendship. So we're not really allowed to talk about friendship in animals, but when we are talking about prosociality between same-sex conspecifics that are not related to one another, and they definitely don't react in a random way towards other individuals, there are studies actually looking at that. So, I do think that there is some kind of what you would call a rat form of maybe friendship.
Yeah. Here. What about the immune system? So you said that you looked at the immune system. Did you see any changes in the immune cells?
That we're working on that right now, so it's a little bit top secret. Okay.
Another one, last one, up there, up there, up there, up there.
Hello. So first of all, thank you for the lecture. It was very interesting. And I wanted to ask, there is a researcher, I think her name is Sherry Turkle from MIT, and she says she's a psychologist, and she said that there is a reduction in empathy in our time And it's a question not about rats, but about humans. In relation to screen, how do you say, social networks, screen meetings, and I wanted to ask if something that you can say something about.
You know, the views are mixed on that one. Some people think we're living in an age of reduced empathy, and others say that we're living in the most empathic age ever compared to human history. So I don't know what I think about that, but I think that we should focus or shift the discussion towards tribalism and the echo chambers that we've been seeing, because I think that the very same person can be incredibly empathic and pro-social towards their in-group, and at the same breath turn around and be very antisocial towards an out-group member. And so I think the social media is amplifying this fact that we've been seeing, even to the point where people, they're so tribal that they're even willing to hurt their own health in order to stay within the tribally determined identity. So I think that is the dangerous slope that we're experiencing. And the way to approach it, I think, is to talk about how we break through those identities.